Welcome back to TrainSignal's Citrix XenApp training. You're watching Configuring NetScaler Access Gateway Enterprise Edition lesson. Now before we get started with this lesson, just a quick disclaimer. I've borrowed this lesson from my other training course, the Citrix Xen Desktop Training 4 and 5, also with TrainSignal. And I've done that for two reasons. First of all, it's a shameless plug for the Xen Desktop 4 and Xen Desktop 5 course. It's a great course. But the other reason I'm telling you this is just in case as we go through the lesson, you're hearing Xen Desktop, or if you see gecko.local, that was the fictitious company that we used in our Xen Desktop scenarios when we recorded that course. So just in case you see those, you're aware of why that's happening. The content is the same. It's very up to date. It's still running on the 9.2 version of NetScaler, which is the latest version that's out there now. So the content is very relevant. I just wanted to make sure you guys were aware of that before we started with this lesson. Alright, so I promise this is probably going to be the coolest lesson of the entire course. And the reason for that is because NetScaler, and the Access Gateway in particular, tends to be a subject that I get asked more questions than anything on. It has this aura of, hey, it's very complicated, I don't know how to configure it, I need help. You know, people freak out when it comes to the NetScaler Access Gateway Enterprise Edition. So what we're going to do with this lesson is I'm going to show you how you can configure it. It's really not that difficult. Keep in mind there's 100 different ways of configuring a NetScaler. This is one scenario that I found is the easiest, most straightforward scenario that I like to configure whenever I'm deploying the NetScaler Access Gateway Enterprise Edition. So feel free to follow, take from this lesson what you need, and then as you go and install it in your environment, I'm sure there'll be small tweaks here and there that you would have to do to it. This is a networking component at the end of the day. So what are we going to cover in this lesson? We're going to talk about the different NetScaler deployment scenarios. Now, obviously, we're not going to do all of the deployment scenarios that are available, but I'm going to list them out. I'm going to show you, some of the basic network deployment scenarios for a NetScaler. We're going to talk about some of the firewall configurations and considerations. So what ports do you need to open? How many IP addresses? How many interfaces? So on and so forth. We're going to talk about some of the terminology. What does SIP mean? What does a MIP mean? What does a virtual server on a NetScaler mean? We're going to talk about how you license a NetScaler. We're going to talk a lot about self-signed SSL certificates. And then I'm going to show you what are the necessary installation and configuration tasks that we have to complete during this lesson. So from an access gateway deployment scenarios, there's a lot of different ways by which you can deploy an access gateway. In this scenario, you're deploying the NetScaler or the access gateway behind the firewall. I personally wouldn't recommend this from a best practices and a security perspective, but it's definitely a way. All you have to do is punch the right ports within the firewall and configure the NetScaler. It's basically on the internal network. So this is definitely one way of deploying it. Another way of deploying the NetScaler would be to have the NetScaler in the DMZ and to also have your web interface server in the DMZ, and then punch the necessary holes through the firewalls. Again, this is another option. I typically don't like to put the web interface in the DMZ as well. It's a Windows box, and if I can put it behind the secure network, I like to put it behind the secure network. The only thing I like to keep in the DMZ is the NetScaler itself. There's always the double hop DMZ, where you have one, possibly two NetScalers, one in your first DMZ, one in the second. You have the web interface that's parallel to the NetScaler, and then you have your secure network. We're not going to do that either. What we're going to deploy is a traditional DMZ type deployment where the NetScaler is actually sitting in the DMZ. You have your web interface in the secure network, and you have all the resources that you need here so that Access Gateway communicates with web interface. Web interface will point to the right resource, and the right resource will communicate back out through the gateway. So all communication happens through the SSL gateway. That's what we are going to deploy. Now, if you go back to the Gecko Xen Desktop architecture, you'll notice that we've also, in our diagrams here, we've depicted the same thing. So you have the DMZ, and you have two NetScalers in it for load balancing purposes if you choose to do so. And then you have the web interface that sits behind the NetScaler in the secure network. So it's not even in the DMZ, it's in the secure network. So that's how we want to configure it. So from a firewall considerations perspective, you'll need to have a couple of different things. So you need two interfaces at least. So you have your Access Gateway NetScaler deployed in the DMZ, we have one interface which is known as the MIP. This is the mapped IP address. Basically, this is the interface that communicates with your STAs, your secure ticket authorities, on ports 80 and 443. So those ports would have to be open from the NetScaler in the DMZ all the way to your STA server. So however many STA servers you want to have. Next, you have your ICA protocol would have to be enabled as well. That's TCP port 1494. And you have your common gateway protocol, or the session reliability protocol, which is 2598. That also has to be enabled between the access gateway and the inside resources. Now, 1494 and 2598 would have to be open to the XenApp farm if you're pointing to XenApp servers, or to the Xen desktop farm, which means the Xen desktop virtual machines or physical machines. So if you want to be able to launch a virtual machine from the outside, those ports would have to be open to the farm. What I like to do is just open 80, 443, 1494, 2598 to the XenApp farm and the Xen desktop either IP range or the entire farm, because it makes it easier as you're adding more virtual machines. Now, out here, or down here, you'll notice that there's an NSIP. NSIP means it's NetScaler IP address. This is for administrative purposes. Again, if you're putting the NetScaler in the DMZ and resources on the inside can't talk directly to the DMZ, so if you need to open ports on the way out as well from the secure network, then these are the ports that you would need to open in order for you to reach the NetScaler from the inside to manage it. You would need ports 80, 22, 30, 10 in order to manage it. Now, from the NetScaler itself to the inside, you will need the following if you're trying to configure LDAP, LDAP secure, radius, so on and so forth, RSA, whatever the case might be. That is also coming through the NetScaler IP address. So all authentication comes through the NetScaler IP address. So this way, these are the ports that you would need to have open. In our deployment, what we're going to do is we're going to avoid punching holes in the firewall for these ports. So what we're going to do is we're going to land the user at the web interface server and have authentication happen here, so I can avoid punching these unnecessary ports in the firewall. So once the user is here, he's already in the secure network, he's over a 443 connection, so why don't I allow him to connect here and authenticate, call it a day, right? I don't have to punch all these holes. So in our scenario, all we would need is 80, 443, 1494, 2598. And for whatever reason, if from your inside network to the NetScaler, you need to open ports, then these would be the ports that you would need to open. Now, this would be two interfaces so far that you need. So on our virtual appliance, what we're going to connect is we're going to have one interface in the DMZ, another interface in the DMZ. That's all we need. Now, we are going to need one IP address, two IP addresses, three IP addresses, but two interfaces, right? So this IP address is going to be the NATed IP address. So on your firewall here, you're going to have an external facing IP address, maybe a 207 or 209. That 209 dot IP address does a NATing to the Virtual Server Access Gateway Enterprise Edition DMZ address, which is here. So that's the third interface you need. Now, what happens here is users connect through this interface. On the way out, and you'll notice that there's an arrow here, everything happens over port 443. So on the way in, you need these ports to be open. Everything on the way out from the web interface goes back to the access gateway, happens on port 443. So to summarize this again, and I'm sorry if I'm being repetitive, but I just want to make sure it's clear, because if this is nailed down, then your NetScaler deployment will be very simple. From the outside to the NetScaler, the only thing you would need to open is port 443. Now, if you want to enable redirection, you also want to make sure it's responding on port 80, and when we go through the demonstration of configuring access gateway, I'll show you how to redirect it. So from outside to the access gateway, 80 and 443 is more than enough. From the NetScaler Access Gateway Enterprise Edition through the MIP to the inside, I need 80, 443, 1494, 2598. If you choose to authenticate at the access gateway, these are the ports you would need to open. And if you want to manage the access gateway from the inside network, you would need to open the following ports if everything is not allowed to the DMZ. All right, so let's talk about some of the terminology here. So virtual server basically refers to the NetScaler Access Gateway Enterprise Edition. The access gateway is nothing more than a virtual server that lives on the NetScaler. Keep in mind, the NetScaler at heart is a load balancing device. What Citrix did is it took the NetScaler and added more functionality to it. So now instead of it just being an application firewall or a load balancer or whatnot, now they've added a virtual server that you can load on the NetScaler and make it an Access Gateway Enterprise Edition. The other thing that we need to talk about from a terminology perspective is, what does an NSIP mean? That means it's a NetScaler administration IP address. NS always reflects NetScaler. The MIP is called a mapped IP address. The mapped IP address is what's going to carry the traffic from the NetScaler to the internal network resources, XenApp, XenDesktop, so on and so forth. Your common gateway protocol, CGP, aka the session reliability, that's going over TCP port 2598. ICA, or Independent Computing Architecture, that's Citrix's flagship protocol that goes over TCP 1494. And you would need that to connect the XenApp servers, XenDesktop machines, so on and so forth. STA is the Secure Ticket Authority. Again, you would need that for the XenDesktop controllers and the XenApp servers that you're designating as STA servers. Licensing. How do you license a NetScaler? Licensing NetScaler is very easy. You have two types of licenses. You have a platform license and you have user connection licenses. A platform license basically enables or disables features on the NetScaler. So for example, if you have a standard edition NetScaler, you get basic load balancing, you get the Access Gateway Enterprise Edition, a couple of other things, but you don't get application firewall. You probably don't get global server load balancing, GSLB. So there are features that don't get enabled. So the platform license enables features on the actual NetScaler itself, what it can and cannot do. And then you have user connection licenses. These are packs. So if you get a license to allow 100 users to connect to the NetScaler, you upload it, and now you have 30 users that can connect to this NetScaler. So very basic, very easy to license the NetScaler. Self-signed SSL certificates. Now, for our demonstration, I don't have a certificate from a certificate authority. So what I have to do in order to make this demonstration successful is I have to self-sign my own certificates. Now, what I've noticed from experience is that a lot of shops don't mind self-signing their own certificates. For those of you that want to use this video for POCs, maybe you're a consultant, maybe you're trying to bring this up in your environment just to see how it works, so you don't want to go out and get a real certificate, I'm going to show you how to create a self-signed certificate using the engine that already exists on the NetScaler. So the steps to do that is we're going to first create a private key. Then we're going to create a certificate signing request, CSR. We're going to create a root certificate. We're going to create a server certificate, intermediate certificate. Then we're going to create 3 key pairs for the above. And then we're going to install the certificate on the Access Gateway, enable some of the SSL functionality on it as well. So what are we going to install? What are we going to configure during this lesson? This is going to be a cool lesson. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to download the NetScaler VPX appliance from the Citrix website. In our case, we're going to download the ESX version of the appliance so that we can load it in our ESX infrastructure. So make sure when you're downloading that, that's the right version you're downloading. The other thing I want to point your attention to here is with a lot of the Citrix products, there's confusion. So when you're going to download this, keep in mind, we are using the NetScaler Access Gateway Enterprise Edition 9.2 in my case. When you go to Citrix, if you select from the drop-down on the Citrix site, Access Gateway, that's going to allow you to download a different type of appliance and you won't be able to follow on screen with me. So be careful when you're downloading it. Don't select Access Gateway and then download. Select NetScaler and then find the VPX installation of NetScaler Access Gateway Enterprise Edition and download that for ESX. So I just wanted to bring that up so that there's no confusion. Once you've downloaded this, we're going to upload this on our virtual infrastructure. We're going to start off by configuring it. We're going to configure the virtual server, the MIP. We're going to configure the NSIP, so on and so forth. We're going to upload a license key so that we have everything in place. Then we're going to talk a lot about configuring the SSL certificates. We're going to spend some time on that. We're going to then move on to configuring the Access Gateway Enterprise Edition. We're going to add session policies. We're going to configure it for iPad and iPod connectivity, so on and so forth. And then we're going to configure the web interface so that it can communicate with the Access Gateway Enterprise Edition. So brace yourselves. We're going to do a lot of things in this lesson, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So at this point, I'm going to switch over to the demonstration so that we can get started. Alright, so what I've done here is I've downloaded the NetScaler VPX appliance to my desktop and I put it in a folder called NS. Now when I downloaded it, obviously I downloaded the version that would be compatible with ESX, since that's the virtual infrastructure that I'm using. So you'll notice in this folder I downloaded the license file and I also downloaded the appliance. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to extract the contents of the zip file. Okay, now I'm ready to import the appliance into my virtual infrastructure. So I've launched Virtual Center, and we're going to point to the file menu up here, deploy OVF template, since this is an appliance. We're going to browse to the location where we have the OVF template. In my case, it's on the desktop in the NS folder, and you'll notice it found it right away. We're going to click Next. Very basic from an import standpoint. We're going to click on Next. I'm going to keep the name the way it is, so I'm not going to change its name. NSVPX-ESX, it's pretty self-explanatory. We're going to point it and keep it on this particular storage. We're going to leave everything at defaults from a virtual disk provisioning perspective. Alright, now the appliance comes by default with two interfaces, two virtual interfaces. So here it's asking, hey, where do you want me to place these interfaces? So in my scenario, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the DMZ. I have a port group for the DMZ. In your environment, this would have to be where you're placing the NetScaler. It would need connectivity. Typically, if it's a DMZ, there should be a DMZ either server that you're deploying this NetScaler to, or there would be a DMZ port group, as it is in my case, where you're deploying the NetScaler and you're having its network interfaces go through this particular port group, which is DMZ in my case. So we're going to click on Next and Finish. Alright, and the import has been completed successfully. We're going to click on Close. Alright, and here it is. So before we do anything else, let's go ahead, right click on it, let's go to Edit Settings. Again, in my deployment, having two interfaces is enough. Depending on what you're going to do in your deployment and depending on the scenario, you might want to deploy additional interfaces to the NetScaler. And you can point them to other networks if you choose to do so. In my case, two interfaces are fine. So we're going to click on Cancel here, and we're going to go ahead and power on the VPX. And let's also open the console so we can see what's going on. Now the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to give it an initial IP so that we can reach it from a web browser and we can continue our configuration. Alright, so I'm going to give it an IP address of 10.4.15.20. This is going to be the management IP address that you're giving. From a subnet mask perspective, we're going to go 255.255.255.0. And from a gateway perspective, we're going to do 10.4.15.1. We're going to select option number 4 to save and quit. There you go. It's going to reinitialize the NetScaler, and at that point we'll be able to access it from a web browser so that we can continue the installation. Alright, so what I'm going to do now at this point is we're going to exit out of the console, and we're going to minimize Virtual Center since we don't need it at this point. And let's go ahead and see if we can connect to the NetScaler. I'm going to open up a browser here, and let's go to 10.4.15.20. And there you go. Now the default username and password is nsroot. nsroot. Now it's going to start initializing. You'll notice up here that you have the ability to do a lot of monitoring. You have a lot of dashboard options, reporting options. The NetScaler is literally a beast of an appliance. It can do a lot of things, but what we're going to focus on from our perspective is we're going to focus on just the Access Gateway Enterprise Edition functionality of the NetScaler. So as soon as you log in for the first time, what it's going to do is it's going to launch the setup wizard. So we're going to use the setup wizard to configure it. I'm going to click on Next. So remember the IP address that we set up at the console? There you go. This is the system configuration. This would be the equivalent of the NS IP address. All of this configuration is valid. We're going to keep it. From a hostname perspective, I'm going to leave the name NS, which is the default. I'm fine with that. We're going to create a mapped IP address. And I'm going to give it the IP of 10.4.15.21 and the same subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. Now, keep in mind, you'll probably need the help of your network administrator while configuring these settings. This is typically a networking device that networking folks should be installing, configuring, and maintaining. Now, these IP addresses are internal IP addresses in my case. In your case, in a DMZ scenario, you might have a 10.x subnet, or you might have a 192 or 172. So the IPs could change. You're just going to request from your network administrator IP addresses depending on the deployment scenario that you're going through. So once you've given it the MIP IP address, we're going to click on Next. Now, from a licensing perspective, I can most certainly browse here and upload the license file, but I want to show you guys how you would license the NetScaler outside of the setup wizard, just in case you want to upload additional licenses or anything to that extent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip this step for now, and we'll upload the license key at a later time. So I'm going to click on Next. And there you go. This completes the initial setup wizard, so I'm going to click on Finish. You got the configuration summary. From this point, you have like quick launch items here. What I'd like to do first and foremost is set the time zone properly. So in my case, it would be Central Standard Time, Chicago, preferably if I can find it in the list. And there you go. I'll click on OK. You can most certainly change the admin password. For me, this is enough at this point. We're going to click on Exit. And there you go. From a networking perspective, just very basic networking, the NetScaler is now configured properly. So to see what we've done, you can expand the networking node here. You can select the IPs, and you'll notice that the NetScaler IP or the NS IP, then you have the mapped IP. Those are configured. You can take a look at the interfaces. You have access to a lot of information at this point. But what I'd like to do first is go ahead and create the Virtual Server Access Gateway Enterprise Edition. So you'll notice down here that there's a node specifically for the Access Gateway. So if we expand that and we go to Virtual Servers, alright, the first thing I want to do is right click on Virtual Servers and say Enable Access Gateway Feature. And then I'm going to right click on it again, and we're going to click on Add. We're going to give this access gateway a name. In my case, I'm just going to call it Access Gateway. Keep it simple. Alright, from an IP address standpoint, this is important. So, if you notice in our diagram back in our presentation, we said that from the outside you would need a NATed address. So that NATed address from the outside would have to point to the Access Gateway IP address. This is important, so keep that in mind. So for me, what I'm going to do is 10.4.15.22. And the other very important thing to note here, and I'm going to show you this again, is max users. Now this is important. Why? Because you might have a license file that has 100 user connections, but you might want to limit the number of users that can connect to this access gateway to, let's say, 100. So in that case, you would limit the max users here. Now this is important because a lot of times you can configure everything properly, but because someone, by default, I think the max users goes to 5, and your license file allows you 100 users, and you've deployed everything and you've gone through all the settings, but when you're trying to connect to the access gateway from the outside and you're deploying it in production, only 5 users can connect at the same time, and you're pulling your hair and you're going through all the configuration, you can't find it. In my opinion, this is a little silly. I don't think this is the right place for it. But make sure that if you want to have the max users connecting here, either put an outrageous number like 10,000 or try to match what you have in the license file with the max users here. I would put a higher number just so you don't have to change it every time you add a new license or add new users. So in my case, I typically like to do 10,000 and just call it a day so I can forget about it and not have to worry about this again. Alright, at this point, before we go any further, let's go ahead and create our virtual server. And there you go. So at this point, the virtual server has been created. Now, it's still going to show status down until we add an SSL certificate to it. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm just going to save my work so far. And I'm also going to refresh the running config. Alright, so now before we go any further, let's go ahead and license the NetScaler so that we don't have any issues down the line, because I've seen a lot of issues that are licensing related and it's just not worth the hassle. Let's go ahead and properly license this thing and then move forward. So what I'm going to do in order to license it is I'm going to expand system here. You'll notice there's a licenses node. I'm going to click down here where it says manage licenses. We're going to add the license from the license file or folder on my desktop. Now for the license file to take effect, you would have to save the running config and you would also have to reboot the NetScaler. So let's go ahead and say yes here. And we're going to click on OK. Alright, so the NetScaler is back up. Let's go ahead and expand system again, licenses, and look at that. It is now licensed properly for 10 users from a max connection. So back to what I was telling you guys before. So the maximum access gateway users allowed is 10. Now this is the initial license file that you just bought. Now if down the line 2-3 months a year you buy another license file, you upload that, and now this turns into 100, and your setting on the actual access gateway itself does not reflect that, then it will cause you a problem. So if we go back into the access gateway here, click on open, that license file corresponds to what is here. So if the license file shows only 100 users and you're setting this to 10, then 90 users won't be able to connect. So that's why I usually put this to a higher number. Alright, so that being said, let's now focus our attention on the SSL certificates so that we can bring the access gateway server to an up state. Alright, from the SSL node here on the left, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a private key. So to do that, we're going to click on Create RSA Key Link. And we're going to name this Gecko PK for private key. And in the key size, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select 512. Feel free to select 1024 if you choose to do so. Based on the VPX appliance that I'm using and the license that I'm using, I can only go up to 512. But if you're using a different appliance, a different license key, you can feel free to sign it with a higher bit rate if you choose to do so. That's all we need to create the key. Now you'll notice that if I click on create here, it won't give you any kind of a confirmation that created anything. So the only way to figure it out, if you click on browse, you'll notice that it created Gecko PK. So we're going to encounter this throughout this GUI. It's just how it functions. So now that we have a private key, we're going to click on close. And the second thing we want to do is we want to go through the certificate request. So I'm going to click on create certificate request. And we're going to give this a name. So I'm going to call it Gecko REQ. The key file name is the private key that we just created. So I'm going to click on browse here and I'm going to select it. I'm not going to use any kind of a passphrase, so I'm going to leave it blank. This is important. Now, by the way, anywhere where you can see a star here denotes that this is a value that is required. You have to fill in that field. So in the common name, this is typically your website name. So make sure whatever you select here, that's what you're going to assign the DNS on the outside so that it can authenticate properly. Now, if you wanted to, you can do a star dot your domain name, which means that this certificate can work on any host name that has the .gecko or .domainname.com in your case. So in my case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this zen.gecko.local. From a city, I'm going to name, or we're going to put this in Chicago. Organization name, we're going to go with Gecko. State is Illinois. The email address is admin@gecko.local. And the organizational unit is IT. That's all you need for the certificate request in order to generate it. So we're going to click on Create. We're going to click on close here. And now we can start creating or signing our own certificates. So the first thing we're going to do is click on create certificate. And we're going to create the root certificate. So I'm going to do gecko root CA. We're going to select the certificate request file that we just created. So if I browse here, you'll notice that it's the REQ file that we just selected. You'll notice I've selected the type of certificate is root-ca. The private key file is gecko pk. I'm going to leave the PEM passphrase blank. The validity, this is in days, so I want it to be valid for 365 days. If you choose to have it valid for longer than that, then you can modify this value accordingly. And that's all you need to create your root certificate. I'm going to go ahead and click on create here. And now let's go ahead and create our server certificate. So what I'm going to do is gecko srv, but I'm going to switch this to server here. The request is the same. The validity is the same, so I'm going to keep it valid for 365 days. The CA certificate file name is the certificate that we just created, which is the root CA. And now the CA key file, that's the private key, which I'm going to select again. Now the CA serial number, this is a file. This is basically a text file that just has numbers in it. It basically enumerates every time a new certificate is issued. You have one by default on the server here, so you might as well use it. It's a file with a .srl extension. You can create your own if you wanted to, but since there is one already, I'm just going to use that. Everything else I'm just going to leave as default. I'm going to go ahead and click on create. That creates my server certificate. I'm also going to create an intermediate certificate. Again, if you want to give or allow connectivity for iPads, iPhones, Droids, whatever, an intermediate certificate is needed. So I'm going to create one, all the same settings. We're going to go ahead and click create. And that's all there is to it. Now at this point, all of my certificates have been created. So what I need to do now is expand the SSL node here, click on certificates, and I need to create 3 key pairs. So we're going to start by creating gecko root, and what I'm going to do here, be nice if I was typing, is select the root certificate, and I'm also going to select the private key. Alright, and this would create the root certificate. Now we're going to do the same thing for the server. We're going to select server here. Install. Now we have our server. Let's go ahead and select our intermediate server or certificate. And voila. Now I have all the necessary key pairs that I need. Now one thing to pay attention to here is you have to enable certain features of SSL. So if you right click on an SSL here, you need to enable SSL feature. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is if you click on the system node up here and you expand it a little bit, go down here to settings. You can also connect or click on configure basic features here. And you'll notice that SSL offloading was checked because I just did it. Otherwise, you can come in here and also enable that if you choose to do so from here. So I'm going to click on close at this point. We're going to minimize that. And now we can go to our Access Gateway server. Go to the virtual server here. Let's go ahead and double click it. And we can add the server certificate here, which will be enough hopefully to get the Access Gateway in an up state. So I'm going to add that. We're going to go ahead and click on OK and see what happens. And there you go. The server is now up and running. Alright, so let's continue on with the configuration. I'm going to go ahead and double click on it again to get into the configuration. And we're going to point to the Published Applications tab here. this is where you'll specify your STA. Now your STA in a XenApp environment is any one of your XenApp servers that you designate as an STA or that you want to point to as an STA. All XenApp servers are STA by default. It's just a matter of which one you want to choose. In XenDesktop, the STA would be the controller. So since we're configuring XenDesktop at this point, I'm going to go ahead and click on Add. I'm going to put in the IP address of my controller. So HTTP. And we're going to do 10.4.15.94. I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. And we're going to go ahead and click OK. Now the only way to figure out if that STA setting was successful is to click OK, go back into it, click on Published Applications, and you'll notice that it automatically got a SID or an identifier and it shows as up, which means there's connectivity now to the STA. So what that tells you at this point is that so far your NetScaler has been configured properly from a networking standpoint. If at this point this shows as down, this means that the NetScaler for whatever reason is unable to communicate back into the internal network to the STA. So that means your connection from the outside isn't going to work and you have to talk to your networking guys and figure out what's going on from a networking perspective. So if you see this as you're configuring your NetScaler, it's a good sign. Let's keep moving. So the second thing we want to do is we want to set some session policies on what happens when users connect to the NetScaler, how they get redirected to the web interface. Now this becomes a little interesting because there are several ways of connecting through the access gateway to the web interface. So we're going to deal with policies here, and we're also going to deal with authentication. Where do you want authentication to happen? So let's start with authentication, since it's the first tab here, or the second tab. From an authentication perspective, if you have enable authentication, what's going to happen is now you have to add the authentication method on the access gateway itself. So if you want Radius, Active Directory, RSA, all of that stuff, if you want the authentication to happen at Access Gateway, you would have to add those down here. Here's my preference, and you would have to create a policy for them, configure them properly, configure access to Active Directory, so on and so forth. Here's my take, here's my preference. I would rather not configure authentication at the Access Gateway, pass it through to the web interface. So make the Access Gateway a pass-through device. It just lands the user at web interface and the user can then authenticate. Web interface is already behind the firewall and the user that's coming in is coming in over a 443 connection, so it's very secure. Why punch holes for different ports in the firewall? Why open the Active Directory or LDAP port? Why open Radius, RSA? You don't need to do that. If you can get the user to the web interface, have them authenticate there. Now, here's the only caveat with that. If you're using the NetScaler as just an access gateway to published applications, published desktops, this would work just fine. If you're trying to use the access gateway for more than that, you want to have maybe SSL VPN or client VPN, whatever the case might be, then at that point you probably have to take a different measure. Now, in order to tell the access gateway that, hey, I don't want to authenticate at access gateway, I want you to do a pass-through, we are going to disable authentication here. Once you've disabled authentication, this basically says, okay, I'm not authenticating you at the gateway. But now to get around that, what we need to do is we need to set some policies. So if I click on policy here, we're going to go ahead and do insert. We're going to double click new policy. We're going to call this access gateway. And we're going to create a new profile for it. Now, we're not configuring the iPad profile just yet, so what I'm going to do here is call this the Access Gateway profile. Down here on the Published Applications tab, we're going to go ahead and enable some features. So from an ICA proxy standpoint, I want to go ahead and turn that on. From a web interface standpoint, I want to point to my web interface, so we're going to do http:10.4.15.94. It will automatically append the default website that is configured on web interface. Now, if you wanted to point to a different instance of the XenApp website or the web interface website, then you could do a /citrix/ that instance name. When we configure the web interface, I'll show you where you can take that value and add it here. But for my purposes, I just want to push it to the default, whatever the server default page is. So this is more than enough for me at this point. And I'm going to go ahead and click on create. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is from this drop-down menu here, we're going to scroll all the way down to true value, and we're going to click on add expression. And we're going to go ahead and click on create. So this creates the access gateway. So everyone that wants to access the access gateway, this is the policy they're going to get. Now, we want to create another policy for iPad and iPod and Droid users. So what we're going to do in that case is we're going to click on insert again. I'm going to double click new policy here. And we're going to call this one iPad. We're going to create a new profile, and we're also going to call it iPad. On the published applications page here, we're going to click on to enable it, and we are going to put in the the fully qualified IP address, in my case 10.4.15.94. And this time what we're going to do is point it to Citrix /PN agent, which means we're pointing it to a different website other than the default website. And this is what I was talking about earlier. If you wanted to create a different website, and I'm going to get into why you would want to specify a different one for the web interface or for the all users that we just created in the earlier profile. But for the iPad, we're going to point it to the PN agent. We're also going to click on create. Now down here, what we want to do is we want to select a different expression. So I'm going to click on add. From the method down here, we're going to select header. From the operator here, we're going to select contains. And we're going to type Citrix receiver. We're going to do user mesh agent. And we're going to go ahead and click on OK. Now we're going to go ahead and create this. And automatically it added this as a lower priority than the access gateway one. And that's what we want. So if when you're creating yours, the iPad policy is higher priority than the access gateway, in other words, is higher priority than the other policy, then you want to make sure that the iPad policy always has the lower priority so that your devices can have a successful connection. Now, if we go back into the iPad profile here, so I'm going to go ahead and double click it. And if we click on modify this time, go back to published applications. One other thing you might want to do, you can point it to this, but if you want to be more specific and if you're having some connectivity issues for whatever reason, you might want to add /config.xml. This points directly to the file that it needs to access. So just in case pointing it just to PN agent wasn't working, depending on the version of the NetScaler that you're using, like version 9.2 and above, it automatically appends the right path. But just in case you're using an earlier version of the NetScaler, I just wanted to make sure to point that out to you so that you don't get stuck at some point. So if you are, you could put a /config.xml, click on OK, and that should take care of that configuration for you. Now if we click on OK, the NetScaler at this point is ready to access or accept connections. However, what we're going to do is I want to show you a few other things. So we added the policies, created policies, so on and so forth. But if you wanted to modify them other than going through the actual server itself, you can expand policies here. And you'll notice that under session policies, you'll see where you created the access gateway and the iPad. Now, if you wanted to do authentication, again, if you wanted to add a radius or an LDAP connection, whatever the case might be, you would have to create all of these under the different policies that you have here. So let's go ahead and minimize that again. All right, now one thing I get asked quite frequently is, hey, how do I redirect users that are going to HTTP to my HTTPS connection directly? Because most users will just tend to put in the IP or the URL without specifying that it's an HTTPS, and then they go to a blank page, and then they call help desk and all hell breaks loose. I can't connect. So how do we redirect? What's an easy way of redirecting? Well, the NetScaler gives you that option. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a service. So if I expand virtual servers and services here, click on virtual servers, we're going to click on add. And what I'm going to call this is redirect access gateway. And we're going to give it the IP address of the access gateway, which is 10.4.15.22. We're redirecting port 80, so all of this stays the same. We're going to click on advanced, and here it gives you the option of, hey, where do you want to redirect it to? So I'm going to do HTTPS 10.4.15.22. Now, if you wanted to give a client timeout, for example, you can do 180 seconds. So when you're done with all of that, we're going to click on Create, and we're going to click on Close. Now, it is okay for this to show down. When the user connects to port 80, it is going to automatically redirect them to HTTPS. So in this case, the state down is not a bad thing. It is a good thing because the access gateway itself is not listening on port 80. It's configured on port 443, but what's going to happen is when it hits port 80, it's going to flip it to 443 automatically. Okay, so this concludes the configuration of the NetScaler. The NetScaler is configured, it's up, it's ready, it's got certificates, licenses, the whole thing. So what I'm going to do for consistency now is I'm just going to save my running config. I'm going to refresh. And I'm going to minimize the NetScaler, and we're going to go ahead and log into the web interface server so that we can make the final tweaks on the web interface server so that it's ready for connectivity. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize that. Let's click on Start, Run. Let's go into the desktop studio. All right, we're going to expand access. We're going to select Citrix Web Interface. We're going to expand that. XenApp Websites. So if I right click on XenApp Websites right now and drag down to where it says Secure Access, right now it's not pointing to the gateway. So if the connection from the outside gets to the web interface is not configured to communicate with the gateway, so the connection is going to fail. So what you have to do here is change this method. So we're going to select it, we're going to click on Edit, and we're going to flip it to Gateway Direct, which means I'm communicating directly with my gateway. We're going to click on Next, and we're going to give it the common name of the gateway. So in my case, what I named it was zen.gecko.local, if you guys remember. Now, you can feel free to keep session reliability on. I choose to turn session reliability off, and I like my connections to go over 1494. But if you wanted session reliability, this is where you would keep it on. So I have this configured. We're going to click on Next. And here you're going to specify your secure ticket authority. Now, because the server that I'm on is also a secure ticket authority, what I'm going to do is HTTP 10.4.15.94. And I'm going to also specify scripts /ctxsta.dll. And you can see here that it's basically asking you to do that. So we're going to go ahead and click on OK. Everything else I want to keep the same. If you had more than one secure ticket authority, you can go ahead and add it here. You can select this box to load balance among them, so that requests are going to one or the other at any given time. We're going to click on Finish. Okay, so what did I just do at this point? Anyone? Did anyone see a problem with this? If I leave it at this point, will anything break in my environment? Well, the answer is yes, something will break, because now what I've done is I've configured this web interface server for external users. So my users that are coming on the LAN, when they hit this web interface, they're going to try to communicate with the access gateway. It's not going to work because they're not coming through the NetScaler. They're hitting it directly. So in this case, now I have a problem. So the only way to get around that problem, or one of the ways to get around that problem, is to create another site for the users. So what you can do in this case is if you right-click here, create site, you'll notice that it's now /Citrix/XenApp with the number 1. So you can click on next. We're going to authenticate at web interface. And we don't want to configure it because we've gone through the configuration before. But so what I wanted to tell you guys, and you can do this in reverse. So if you wanted to select XenApp 1 for external users, then when we were on the NetScaler and we were specifying the IP address or the fully qualified domain name of our web interface, then what you would have to do is append it with a /Citrix/XenApp1. Now the reason we didn't have to do it the way I configured it is because I asked it to point to just whatever the default of the web server is. And when we were creating this first site, if you guys remember, there was a checkbox that we selected so that this site becomes the default site for this particular server. So when I'm pointing directly to it, it's automatically redirecting to /Citrix/XenApp. But there's no reason why you can't flip these around and have the NetScaler point to XenApp1 and keep this for internal users if you choose to do so. Now, configuring the second site is just as configuring the first one. It's the same parameters, so on and so forth. Now, from the XenApp services site's perspective, we're going to do exactly the same thing. So we're going to right-click on it. We're going to drag down here to Secure Access, and we're going to change this again to Gateway Direct, and we're going to go through the same process. Put in zen.gecko.local, go through the same configuration. Let's go ahead and do that. We're going to disable session reliability. We're going to add the STA. Finish. And we're going to create a second site here for our internal resources, and you'll notice PNAgent1, and we're not going to configure it at this point. And voila! So at this point, your NetScaler, your access gateway, your web interface, they're all configured to work properly together. Open a web browser, point to the web address from the outside, launch your applications, launch your desktops. You should be good to go. Cool lesson, huh? All right, so what we're going to do is we can't test it considering I don't have a public-facing IP address or a public DNS name that I can configure. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I know this works. I've done it 100 times, so I promise if you configure it based on what we went through, it will work. That being said, we're going to flip back to our presentation now and recap what we've learned. All right, so let's recap what we learned in this lesson. So we started off by talking about the different NetScaler deployment scenarios. We talked about double hop. We talked about placing the access gateway and the web interface in the DMZ. We talked about placing the NetScaler behind the firewall in the inside and the internal network. And we said that from our perspective, from our configuration, we're going to deploy the NetScaler on its own in the DMZ and configure it that way. We then moved on to talk about some of the firewall configurations and considerations. Which ports do we need to open? How does the communication and the flow go through? How many interfaces? How many IP addresses? What's NATing? What do I need to open from the outside? We went through all of that. We talked about the terminology. What does an NSIP mean? That's a NetScaler IP. What does a MIP, mapped IP address? What does the CGP mean? That's the Common Gateway Protocol. What is the ICA, Independent Computing Architecture? So we went through all the terminology that we need from a NetScaler perspective, and then we moved on to licensing. We talked about the difference between a platform license and a user connection license. Platform license allows you to enable features on the NetScaler itself, like application firewall, global server load balancing, so on and so forth, whereas a user connection license is simply a connectivity pack that allows a number of users to get access to the NetScaler. We talked about self-signed certificates quite extensively, and during the demonstration we went through the whole process from A to Z on how to create requests, private keys, server, intermediate certificate, root certificate, the whole 9 yards. And then we covered the installation and configuration tasks from the web interface to the NetScaler Access Gateway to the session policies. We configured everything. Finally, I hope this lesson was fun and informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.